Can you believe that an entire civilization, a world built on the soft, familiar gleam of copper and tin, could be utterly obliterated, not by an invading army, but by a simple, terrifying color change?
Imagine waking up one morning, roughly 800 years before the birth of Christ, ready to face the world with your tried and true bronze axe, only to realize that every single one of your neighbors suddenly possessed a weapon that could slice your inheritance, your very life, in half, leaving your ancestral shield splintered into worthless dust. This is not a legend. This is the truth of Britain, when the ground beneath their feet ceased to be a source of valuable ore and became instead a terrifying, silent judge of survival.
Her catastrophe no one saw coming arrived on the back of a whisper, carried across the narrow, misty sea from the dark, menacing heart of mainland Europe, and it was made of iron. For centuries, the people of this misty island, these powerful ancestors we barely remember, had mastered bronze. They crafted magnificent ceremonial shields, delicate tools, and weapons that required immense skill, complex ritualistic trade routes, and a sacred devotion to the forge. But bronze demanded cooperation. It demanded stability, shared resources, and a deep understanding of metallurgy that kept the secrets tightly held among a select, powerful few, the Bronze Age elite. When the global economic system that supported this delicate structure collapsed, when the sea lanes turned deadly and the suppliers vanished, the delicate balance of power shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Into that gaping void, that terrible darkness of resource scarcity and fear, stepped the most lethal, most democratic weapon the world had ever known. Crude, black, unforgiving, iron. Iron was cheap. Iron was abundant. Iron was brutal. It didn't gleam with the comforting luster of sacred bronze. It held a black, sullen, murderous weight. Suddenly, any minor tribe, anyone with a patch of bog ore and enough heat, could forge a weapon superior to the masterpieces of the established, wealthy kings. This wasn't progress, friends. This was anarchy disguised as technology. The immediate, terrifying result, a paranoid nightmare that forced 500,000 people to abandon the safety and fertility of the river valleys and begin digging. Digging the largest earthworks, the most colossal fortifications ever conceived on this island. Structures so massive they still defy the logic of pre-Roman engineering. They were called Hillforts, and they were the last, desperate, monumental gasp of a civilization built entirely upon absolute terror. Picture the sheer, staggering scale of this collective terror. We're talking about defenses like Maiden Castle in Dorset, a monument so immense, so ridiculously over-engineered, it required millions of man-hours, decades of grueling labor, all just to build concentric walls high above the plains where they could see the danger coming miles away. They weren't just building walls. They were building monuments to their own fear, monuments to the sudden, lethal democratization of weaponry. Triple ramparts, sheer, terrifying ditches carved into solid chalk, designed specifically to funnel an attacker, a fellow Briton armed with cheap iron, into a deadly, narrow killing field. Why? What danger was so profound that it necessitated abandoning fertile land for windswept, defensible, and often cold peaks? The answer is simple and profoundly chilling. Inescapable internal warfare, fueled by the terrifying, superior efficiency of the iron spear and the iron sword. Britain was no longer a collection of cooperating Bronze Age villages. It was rapidly transforming into a mosaic of fiercely independent, often murderous tribes. The Catuvalauni, the Iceni, the Brigantes, names that would echo in fear through the Roman legions centuries later, were forming now, forged in the fires of conflict and defined by their defenses. Each tribe now staked its own territory, shouted its own dialect, worshipped its own furiously jealous god, and above all, fiercely protected its own Hillfort, a badge of defiance, an unassailable high-ground fortress where they could hoard their grain and their precious iron tools. Life expectancy plummeted as suspicion became the universal language. The age of the localized chieftain was over. The age of the ruthless, centralized warlord was beginning. And the landscape itself became a vast, terrifying armed camp, waiting for the next attack. The air itself changed. It ceased to smell merely of river mud and sacred smoke, and began to smell predominantly of burning wood, banked fear, and the metallic tang of newly forged weapons. The forests, once pathways, became hostile boundaries. The wide open plains, once open grazing grounds, quickly turned into lethal killing zones. To survive the Iron Age was to master suspicion and paranoia. You didn't just worry about starvation or plague. You worried constantly about the small, silent raiding party that understood how to use the morning fog to their advantage, wielding weapons that never dulled. Every farming season became an unbearable gamble. Every single harvest had to be guarded, not just stored, because the grain housed within the ramparts was the key to winter survival, and therefore the key to absolute political power and dominance. The Hillfort was more than a defense. It was an economic engine, a political headquarters, and a chilling physical reminder of the violence waiting just beyond the rampart's edge. It represented the ultimate commitment. We are unified, we are defended, and we will die on this high, windy ridge before we descend back into the chaos of the plain. The shift from bronze to iron wasn't just a metal replacement. It was a societal and psychological revolution built entirely on collective panic. It fundamentally changed how they worshipped, how they farmed, and most dramatically, how they fought and died. We are about to journey deep into the heart of this Iron Age, not as detached historians viewing static diagrams, but as storytellers, breathing life back into the screaming earth of these magnificent, forgotten fortresses. Get ready, because the true chronicle of Iron Age Britain is a saga of magnificent ingenuity, built entirely upon absolute, soul-crushing terror. This is the first chapter of the Sleep Chronicle, Iron Age Britain, and we must understand the fear to understand the fortress. For 2,000 years, Britain slept a deep, predictable sleep, the profound, golden slumber of the Bronze Age. It was a time when the rhythm of life was dictated not by immediate aggression, but by the careful, almost ceremonial, exchange of copper and tin. These rare elements were the keys to power, controlled by specific, entrenched families who guarded the secret roots and the delicate metallurgy with their very lives, ensuring a brittle yet enduring peace across the landscape, defined by scarcity. The system worked precisely because bronze was exclusive. A finely crafted bronze sword was a priceless heirloom, passed down generations, rarely used for true slaughter, often serving more as a badge of high office than a practical tool of war. The sheer economic barrier to entry maintained a careful balance of power, concentrating violence and authority in the hands of the very few, the powerful high chiefs who ruled from their small, undefended settlements. But the moment the first whisper of the new metal reached the shores of Albion, a deep metallic tremor carried north by desperate travelers and mercenary ships, that fragile, carefully constructed societal architecture began to crumble into dust. The new magic was iron, and it was terrifyingly common. This was the core catastrophe, the silent killer of the old world order. Iron was the great, brutal democratizer of violence. Suddenly, the poor farmer, the disgruntled youth, the ambitious outcast who couldn't afford the luxury of imported bronze, could forge a weapon equally sharp, equally deadly, sometimes even superior in edge retention and durability, right from the dirt beneath his feet. The exclusivity that guaranteed the High Chief's traditional power vanished overnight, dissolving in a plume of bog iron smoke rising from simple, newly built bowl furnaces across the lowlands. No longer did you need complex, long-distance trade networks spanning continents to acquire copper from distant mines or tin from Cornwall. Iron ore was local, accessible, and easily smelted using nothing more than charcoal and brute labor. The shift was not a gradual technological upgrade. It was an instantaneous, societal trauma. Imagine a world where every single citizen, previously disarmed by economics and resource control, suddenly found accessible, military-grade weaponry within a day's walk. The skirmishes that were once rare, formalized and ritualistic engagements instantly mutated into blood feuds of devastating efficiency and horrifying scope, waged by everyone against everyone else. The Bronze Age elite, those powerful men who wore their status like a metallic crown, watched in paralyzed horror as their monopoly dissolved into universal fear. Their priceless bronze shields, once capable of turning a glancing blow, were now pitted, cleaved, and often shattered by the relentless, sharper edge of the new, cheaper, more readily available black metal wielded by the common man. This sudden, overwhelming proliferation of easily manufactured weapons meant that the primary threat was no longer the distant professional warrior. The threat was your immediate neighbor, the clan downriver, the disgruntled tribe that previously lacked the means to challenge your authority. Every previously open settlement became critically vulnerable, every harvest a high-risk target, every night fraught with the terror of a sudden, cheap raid. To defend against this ubiquitous menace, the old wooden palisades were a pathetic joke, a flimsy screen against a tide of iron-tipped paranoia. They needed something colossal, something that could withstand not just a direct assault, but the constant, lingering threat of a society fundamentally broken by metallurgical equality. They needed walls that spoke of permanence and absolute, uncompromising defiance. This is where the Hillforts emerged, not as centers of commerce or peace, but as massive, collective bunkers of terror, vast, layered defenses meticulously engineered to turn the terrain itself into an insurmountable weapon. We are talking about the emergence of multivalent systems, multiple rings of staggering ramparts, often timber-laced and revetted with stone, designed to absorb impact, delay attackers, and confuse the enemy into exposing their flanks before they even reached the core settlement. But the true genius, the truly terrifying aspect of the Hillfort project was the sheer, unbelievable scale of the labor required. Building these giants, whether Maiden Castle in Dorset or Cadbury Castle in Somerset, was a generational, communal endeavor, requiring thousands upon thousands of man-hours to move staggering amounts of earth and stone. It was a deliberate, collective trauma, a way of enforcing absolute tribal unity and loyalty through shared, exhausting, life or death engineering. Pay close attention to the gateways of these fortresses. These were not simple openings in the wall. They were complex, intricate killing zones, vast mazes designed with overlapping stonework and towering guardhouses, demanding that any attacker approach sideways and uphill, exposing their unshielded right flank to merciless defensive fire. And what was the projectile of choice? If iron democratized the sword, it was the sling that democratized the missile weapon. A cheap, effective, terrifying weapon that could be wielded by anyone. Launching carefully shaped egg-sized stones had velocities rumored to be comparable to modern handguns. A sudden, blinding rain of localized terror delivered by dozens of defenders hidden high above in the ramparts. This entire project wasn't born of prosperity or strategic planning. It was rushed into existence during a time of immediate, overwhelming, and lethal danger. Monuments built upon the chilling fact that the Bronze Age sleep was over, shattered forever. The Iron Age required constant, agonizing vigilance, and the world had suddenly gone dark, and only massive walls could keep the creeping, existential paranoia at bay. The air itself tasted of rust and betrayal. They hadn't just discovered a new metal. They had forged a weapon against peace. an instrument that ripped through the very social contract of the Bronze Age, where prestige and rarity somewhat controlled the bloodshed. Now iron was cheap, it was everywhere, and it demanded blood, a horrifying, efficient dividend on every ore seam discovered beneath the damp British earth.
The realization hit them like a fully forged axe head. The old ways of defense, the wicker fences and the minor stockades, were obsolete, laughably fragile against the silent, swift aggression that iron enabled. The long sleep of relative stability was over, and the only path forward was an engineering nightmare, a monument built out of sheer, unadulterated terror. They needed walls that scraped the sky, walls that were not just defenses, but psychological declarations of defiance against the inevitable. Consider the sheer, heartbreaking physics of it. These were not the Romans with their legions of specialized engineers and standardized tools. These were farmers, herders, and blacksmiths, suddenly tasked with moving mountains. The very definition of communal life shifted from shared harvests to shared, agonizing labor. Thousands of men, women, and children, driven by the chilling whisper of what their neighbors might now carry in their belts, abandoned the vital rhythms of the seasons to carve the land. They hauled millions of tons of chalk, clay, and rock up impossible slopes, using only muscle, crude wooden sledges, and the terrifying knowledge that if they stopped, the newly sharpened world would consume them whole. This was the birth of the Hillfort, the ultimate expression of communal fear, a terrifying promise etched into the landscape itself, requiring a coordinated, massive effort previously unimaginable in tribal society. It was the moment tribal Britain turned inward, sacrificing everything for the illusion of safety high above the vulnerable valleys. Look closely at the engineering of a place like Maiden Castle, or the stark, unforgiving lines of Cadbury Castle in Somerset. These weren't mere piles of stones tossed casually onto a ridge. They were layered nightmares of defense, sometimes encompassing 5 concentric rings of sheer, overwhelming threat. The first line of defense wasn't a wall at all, but a monumental, V-shaped ditch, often 20 feet deep and wide enough to swallow a chariot. This primary ditch was designed not only to slow the rush of attackers, but to break their formation, to shatter ankles, and most importantly, to break their morale before they ever reached the main rampart. But the true genius, the truly paranoid stroke of design, lay in the ramparts themselves. These massive earthen and stone walls, sometimes reaching 30 feet high from the base of the ditch, were often reinforced with sophisticated timber frameworks. This technique, known in later centuries as the Murus Gallicus style, involved massive wooden beams woven throughout the earthwork, locking the structure together and making it incredibly difficult to undermine or burn down. This required an endless deforestation campaign that stripped the surrounding hills bare, a resource drain that further heightened the social stakes. The irony was devastating. They needed the very metal they were built to defend against.
Thousands upon thousands of iron nails and implements were required to secure the internal timber lacing of these walls, a constant, necessary expenditure that proved the new metal's dominance, even in the act of resistance. And then there were the gates. If the walls were the body armor of the community, the gates were the exposed, trembling heart. No simple archway could suffice in this era of acute paranoia. The entranceways became twisted, overlapping mazes of stone and timber, known archaeologically as inturned entrances or complex hornworks. You didn't just walk into a hill fort. You were forced to traverse a funnel of existential terror, a narrow, agonizing passage where defenders stood poised on high platforms, ready to rain down fire, stones, and iron-tipped spears from 3 different protected angles. Every visitor, every returning resident, had to walk that gauntlet, proving their loyalty and submission with every agonizing step past the watchful eyes of the terrorized few. This was not hospitality. This was survival theater, a daily reminder that the world outside the walls was now uniformly hostile, and the slightest lapse in vigilance meant certain, swift destruction. The move to the hill fort, driven by the cheap efficiency of iron weaponry, was not a gradual urban migration. It was an emergency evacuation, a sudden, brutal centralization of power. The societal vacuum created by this massive forced effort demanded leadership. Who controlled the gates? Who organized the impossible labor rosters? Who held the limited supply of iron tools and supervised the endless maintenance of the fortifications? The emergence of the powerful chieftain, the warlord, was inevitable and absolutely necessary for survival. Before the Iron Age, status was often measured in cattle and rare bronze trinkets passed down through generations. Now, status was measured in the depth of your ditch, the height of your rampart, and the readiness of your iron-tipped militia. The landscape of power was reorganized overnight, forging the rigid, warlike social hierarchies that would dominate the next millennium of British history. Within these massive, defended enclosures, the world shrunk. The fields, the forests, the ancestral shrines, they were secondary now, sources of resources that had to be risked daily. The wall was the primary deity, the source of all safety and all anxiety, demanding constant sacrifice and vigilance from its terrified inhabitants. The hill forts stood, silent, brooding giants scarring the British skyline, monuments to a sleep that could never be recovered. They were the physical manifestation of the knowledge that the technological genie was out of the bottle, and metal could now spill blood faster than nature could heal the wounds. But the walls only kept the enemy out. They did nothing to quell the paranoia inside. Imagine the tension. Hundreds or thousands of people crammed onto a windswept plateau, listening to the night winds howl against the ramparts,
knowing that the very metal they depended on to build their defenses was the instrument their rivals were forging right now, just across the valley, ready to launch their own desperate attack. The Iron Age was a constant, grueling calculation of risk and reward, a world where the fear of the neighbor was the only constant that truly mattered. The tribes had built their fortresses, yes, but they had also built their prisons, and those prisons were about to start fighting each other, turning Britain into a chessboard of high-walled terror, setting the stage for the true, bloody zenith of the Iron Age warfare and the ultimate price of security. The chilling echo of the iron axe didn't just build walls, it fundamentally reshaped the very soul of the land, forcing a societal metamorphosis that was brutal, immediate, and utterly inescapable. Imagine the sheer, unimaginable agony of moving those millions of tons of chalk and earth, the monumental scar carved into the ancient green face of Britain, driven by the knowledge that the alternative was annihilation, swift and cold. They weren't just digging ditches. They were defining the boundaries of survival itself, paying a staggering collective tax in sweat, broken hands, and desperate, silent prayers to the new god of technological violence. The Hillfort was not a cozy village elevated. It was a total environmental conversion, a sanctuary forged on the bedrock of collective paranoia, demanding an unbreakable, terrifying contract with the high ground and perpetual readiness. Inside those towering, multi-layered ramparts, the relaxed, scattered farming settlements of the Bronze Age evaporated under the crushing weight of necessity. Where once trust was assumed, now vigilance was mandatory. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of souls were packed tight, a dense, pulsating, highly combustible heart of humanity clinging desperately to the summit, forced into immediate, terrifying proximity. This wasn't merely congregation. This was total social reorganization, demanded by the new economics of defense. Who controlled the limited access to the central well? Who guarded the single, vulnerable, narrow gate? The power dynamic shifted instantaneously, consolidating into the hands of the few, the most ruthless, the most capable of commanding the overwhelming labor, and, crucially, the most skilled at wielding the new, sharp, devastating technology. The traditional chieftain, the respected elder, was instantly obsolesced and replaced by the warlord king, a military dictator whose legitimacy rested entirely upon his demonstrated ability to keep the iron outside the walls, or to wield it better and more brutally than his rivals in the surrounding valleys. Water became the ultimate currency. Grain stores transformed from harvest surplus into strategic military reserves, meticulously guarded. Every single aspect of life, from the location of the central shrine used for appeasement to the tightly packed livestock pens, was mapped out and determined by the chilling, unforgiving logic of siege warfare and defensive viability. Look closely at the architecture of these earthen giants, and you see the physical manifestation
of sheer terror realized in geometry. The defenses were not simple lines. They were complex, staggering labyrinths, designed explicitly to bleed the attacker dry and break their will to fight before they ever reached the living core. We call them multivariate defenses, multiple rings of ramparts, often 3 or 4 layers deep, each separated by deep, unforgiving V-shaped ditches that acted as lethal traps designed to break the momentum and formation of a charging enemy force. An invading foe would have to climb the outermost wall, only to find themselves instantly trapped in a killing zone between the first and second ramparts, suddenly facing a hailstorm of tennis ball-sized slingstones hurled with devastating accuracy and force by defenders standing safe and high above on the inner earthwork. But the true genius, the terrifying pinnacle of this defensive innovation, was reserved for the entrance itself. The gateway was the throat of the Hillfort, and it was engineered to choke the invader absolutely. Instead of a straight, honorable path, the walls would turn sharply inward upon themselves, creating what archaeologists call in-turning entrances, long, narrow, funnel-like passages of death. Attackers would be forced to proceed single file, their ranks broken, unable to effectively use their long spears or even their precious new iron swords in the constricted space. This passage was not an entrance, it was death row, where they would be exposed, flank and front, to defenders positioned strategically on the flanking walls above them, raining down terror. Every single design choice, every ton of earth shifted, screamed one brutal, undeniable truth. If you come this way, you will die here. Britain was now permanently fractured. It was no longer a network of loosely connected clans, but a chain of heavily fortified, isolated microstates, glaring perpetually at each other across the deep valleys and the now sacred high ground. The Hillforts defined the political map. They were the capital cities of fear, the centers of new aggressive and highly territorial identities. If you belonged to the great stone stronghold of Maiden Castle, your nearest neighbor at Hod Hill was not a trading partner, but your immediate, existential, iron-wielding threat. Trade did not stop entirely, but it became a tense, highly regulated affair, conducted under the intimidating shadow of armed escort and wary eyes. Every single negotiation was a risk. Every journey outside the protection of the walls became a gamble with sudden, violent death in the contested void. The land between the great forts, the deep valleys and rolling plains, became the contested, desperate buffer zone, the wild frontier where raiding parties from one summit would clash violently with the scouting parties of another, testing the defenses, searching constantly for weaknesses, or just seeking to steal enough desperately needed cattle to feed their demanding, crowded, and hungry population. The Hillfort Age was not simply about defending against the unknown. It was about defining the us and the them with brutal, final clarity, hardening the boundaries of identity with blood, and the terrifying geometry of sharpened iron. The ultimate crushing cost of this manufactured security was perpetual, exhausting vigilance, the complete and total erasure of peace, and the terrible, gnawing realization that the only thing worse than fighting outside the walls was dying slowly and fearfully inside them, waiting for the inevitable siege to begin. The silence inside Maiden Castle was never truly silent. It was a buzzing, omnipresent hum of 6,000 beating hearts, synchronized not by community, but by the cold, steel-edged fear of discovery. They had survived the terror of the transition, the feverish exhaustion of hauling tons of chalk and stone up impossible slopes. But the true nightmare began the moment the last rampart was raised, and the massive timber gate bar slammed shut. The air thickened with the metallic smell of too many bodies, the smoke of banked fires clinging to the damp woolen tunics, and the desperate, unspoken question echoing off the colossal earthworks. How long until they find us? This wasn't salvation. It was a gigantic, meticulously constructed cage, and the Iron Age had just locked the door from the inside. Survival wasn't a spiritual matter anymore. It was cold, brutal arithmetic. It was the terrifying daily calculation of how many sunrises remained until the communal grain pit ran dry. Or worse, until the precious, life-giving spring outside the walls, the very reason they chose this accursed hill, was poisoned, diverted, or simply seized by the enemy below. The ancient wisdom of the Bronze Age shamans was instantly worthless. The engineers and the hydrologists, the few desperate survivors of the old elite who still remembered how to read the complex layers of the earth, were suddenly the most crucial people alive. They were tasked with guaranteeing the very breath of the community. They dug deep, snaking trenches, and lined them with painstakingly prepared clay and sweat, creating complex systems of underground cisterns that felt less like plumbing and more like religious shrines dedicated to the goddess of thirst. Every single drop of rain that fell upon the vast exposed surface of the Hillfort was meticulously channeled and collected, treated as the most valuable asset in the entire settlement. Every empty stomach was a ticking clock, and the sheer, horrifying volume of resources needed to sustain a population of thousands on an isolated hill was the true, grinding reality of Iron Age paranoia. They weren't just defending themselves from hostile tribes. They were defending themselves from hunger, which was always the first, most reliable scout of the enemy siege army. The old ways of consensus, ritualized duel, and respectful trade died a sudden, bloody death the day the first iron sword tasted blood. The new currency wasn't bronze or amber. It was the chilling, undeniable competence in killing. In the shadows of the immense ramparts, a new, terrifying social class solidified its dominance. The specialized warrior, the Iron Masters themselves. They were the ones who carried the frightening weight of the new metal,
The terrifying, symmetrical, long iron swords that made the old bronze leaf blades look like fragile children's toys.
These were the masters of the emerging Latin style. The deadly, elegant curves and cruel diamond-hard points, designed not just to wound, but to utterly disable and shock, ripping through leather shields, sinew, and bone with horrific, immediate ease. This metal did not merely cut, it ended arguments instantly and irrevocably. These warriors, often mounted on terrifying, rattling chariots, those roaring, unstable platforms of terror, became the undisputed, lightning-fast lords of the open landscape. The chariot was the ultimate symbol of this new, terrifying speed. It was lightning strapped to an axle, piloted by two screaming demons, one driving, one wielding the long, deadly spear, scything through the ranks of unprepared, slow-moving infantry before melting back into the tree line. The speed of the attack made traditional Bronze Age shield walls obsolete. You couldn't brace against a terror that moved faster than your own reaction time. It was a terrifying, elegant machine of murder, forcing Hillfort defenses to evolve into even more complex, desperate systems, designed specifically to break the wheels and the sheer, deadly momentum of these cavalry nightmares. The defenders had to construct intricate, passive defenses, deep, hidden pits disguised by brush, spiked obstacles known only to the sentries, and multiple, staggered lines of ditch and bank that forced the attacker to slow down and bleed their energy long before they ever reached the main, terrifyingly vulnerable gatehouse. But even these defenses could not stop the creeping, psychological erosion. Sleep became the single most dangerous act of the day. To close your eyes was to invite the possibility of the unseen attack, the sudden, sharp shout that meant the end of everything you had built, everything you had feared. Sentries walked the enormous, sloping ramparts, their faces etched with chronic, debilitating exhaustion, staring perpetually into the pitch-black void beyond the multiple lines of timber and ditch, seeing shapes in the wind and hearing phantom whispers in the dry, rustling gorse. The Hillforts were supposed to be safe havens, monuments to defense, but they rapidly became crucibles of constant, grinding psychological warfare. Every shadow was a hostile scout. Every distant fire was a signaling beacon for the inevitable invasion force that was gathering just beyond the horizon, watching, waiting for the slightest moment of vulnerability. The true disaster of the Iron Age wasn't just the efficient, terrible metal. It was the total annihilation of trust and the complete eradication of rest. No one moved alone. No one slept soundly. They were living, breathing monuments to fear, waiting for the clanking sound of steel against stone that meant their fragile, carefully constructed world was finally, horribly, collapsing in on itself.
The terrifying realization cemented itself deep in the hearts of the besieged population. They had built the strongest defense known to man, yet they had also built the most exquisite, most terrifying trap, where the only escape left was either total surrender or agonizing certain death.
They stood on the ramparts, not as the masters of the landscape, but as terrified prisoners in their own magnificent cage. The earthworks they had piled high against the terrifying efficiency of the new metal now stood as the ultimate jailer, sealing them off from the world they once knew, a world of open fields and easy, peaceful travel.
Every sunset brought not the promise of rest, but the cold realization that they were still alive, still trapped, meticulously watching the dark forests for the faintest glint of iron that meant annihilation, the sudden, silent end of their entire world. The Hillfort was salvation, yes, but it was also a monument forged from pure, distilled human panic, an engineering miracle born of technological catastrophe.
The sheer scale of these structures defied rational belief. Megalithic monstrosities built not from communal ambition, but from sheer, desperate, existential terror. They were designed not just to repel an attack, but to shatter the enemy's will, turning the act of war into a torturous psychological trial before the first actual blade even tasted blood.
A single imposing rampart was never enough to secure survival against the swift lethality of the Iron Age. Survival demanded multiple rings of defense, a terrifying series of concentric circles that forced any attacking force to commit to a brutal, uphill, winding climb under constant, unceasing, murderous observation from above.
Imagine the unimaginable labor, the millions upon millions of cubic yards of soil, chalk and stone, moved by hand. An entire generation sacrificed solely to build a wall high enough to defy fate, knowing that one small lapse in construction, one moment of weak discipline, meant the sudden, certain end of everything they held sacred.
But the true horror, the engineering genius born of pure, unadulterated dread, lay not in the walls themselves, but in the gate system. This was the fortress's heart, but also its most exquisitely designed killing zone. An enemy might manage to breach the outermost wall, elated by their perceived success, only to be immediately drawn into a narrow, twisting corridor of stone and timber, often flanked by huge, towering defensive bastions that loomed over them like avenging gods. This was the infamous death funnel, a claustrophobic, maze-like approach specifically engineered to break the formation and cohesion of any organized assault, forcing disciplined soldiers into panicked, single-file lines, rendering the devastating advantage of their iron weaponry completely moot.
As they stumbled through the overlapping earthworks, completely disoriented and unable to use their shields effectively, Missiles rained down from above with relentless, horrifying precision. Rocks, spears, sling stones, and sometimes even cauldrons of burning pitch and excrement. The approach turned into a brutal, agonizing gauntlet, where every frantic step forward only brought them closer to their inevitable, choking doom, sealed in by smoke, panic, and the sheer physical weight of the fort's wrath. Inside the fortress walls, life was transformed into a permanent state of high alert, a societal pressure cooker constantly simmering with paranoia, exhaustion, and the bitter taste of fear. The Hillfort was a logistical nightmare that demanded total, unforgiving control from its leaders. Every single resource, every handful of grain, every drop of water collected from the deep well shafts, every piece of precious firewood had to be calculated, rationed, and relentlessly hoarded, stored in massive, bell-shaped underground storage pits known as souterrains. These pits were deep, cool, and meticulously lined with woven baskets or stone slabs, preserving the precious harvest against the inevitable, brutal siege that everyone knew was coming, turning the simple act of eating into a constant, tense negotiation with mortality and long-term scarcity. The old, fluid ways of the Bronze Age, the loose, migratory structures, the reverence for distant ancestry, and the relaxed rhythm of seasonal trade were violently suffocated by the necessity of total militarized defense. A new, rigid, and ruthless hierarchy immediately emerged. Leadership now belonged not to the elder wise man, but to the warlord, the strategist, the man who understood the cold geometry of siege warfare, the lethal flow of iron, and the cold discipline required to hold the line against unimaginable external pressure. These figures were hardened by the sudden, terrifying transition. Men whose hearts had been forged into the same cold, unforgiving metal they were fighting against. Their power was now absolute, enforced by the stark necessity of collective survival. Dissent was not merely dangerous, it was an immediate existential threat to the entire fortress community. A single whisper of disagreement was a weakness the enemy could exploit with catastrophic speed and finality. Sleep, therefore, became a luxury few could truly afford. The sentries walked the high ramparts day and night, their eyes burning with exhaustion, constantly searching the horizon for the telltale smoke of a massive raiding party, or the sudden, unnatural, chilling silence that often preceded a brutal dawn attack. Children grew up knowing only the view from the wall, their entire reality defined by the huge earthworks and the constant thrumming fear of the world outside, never truly grasping the freedom their grandparents had known in the open, unfortified lands. This was the ultimate, horrifying price of iron, a collective descent into a fortified, claustrophobic existence, where every breath taken inside the perceived safety of the walls was a silent,
desperate acknowledgement of the unspeakable savagery lurking just beyond the palisade. The hill fort saved them from the sword, but in doing so, it irrevocably stole their peace, replacing it with the chilling, eternal watch of the terrified. The fear was a cruel master, demanding tribute not in gold or sacrifice, but in sheer, agonizing labor. These hill forts, now dotting the horizon like scars on the green skin of Britain, represented an engineering feat so stupendous it should have taken generations. Instead, it was rushed through in a terrified frenzy, driven by the chilling knowledge that the next iron blade was already being sharpened in the valley below. Every muscle strain, every snapped rope, every blister was a debt paid to the god of survival. They moved Earth on a scale never before witnessed in these islands. The classic British hill fort structure, the terrifying, multi-layered defense, was not a simple wall. It was an escalating gauntlet designed to break the attacker's will before the axe even struck. The first line of defense was the formidable ditch, often V-shaped and dug so deep that it could easily swallow a horse whole, designed to slow the initial rush and force the enemy into unavoidable bottlenecks. Following this, often came the counterscarp, a smaller outer bank of earth, designed specifically to maximize the confusion and force attackers to climb uphill not once, but twice, before they even reached the primary barrier. This double effort was psychological warfare as much as physical defense. Exhausting the enemy's body was the surest way to collapse their morale. And then, the ultimate terror, the rampart itself, the colossal earthwork wall. For some tribes, facing the sheer, aggressive efficiency of their iron-wielding neighbors, this structure was reinforced not just with packed clay, but with elaborate, brutal timber lacing. Massive logs, sometimes full trees, were interwoven deep within the mound, creating a hidden, rigid skeleton that held the earth structure solid against siege engines, or more critically, against catastrophic weather-driven collapse. This timber framework, often invisible beneath the protective layer of soil and chalk, was the silent, technological secret of their defense. It was a constant acknowledgement that the earth itself needed to be held together by brute force and cunning engineering, just like the fragmented, terrified tribes huddled inside its embrace. But the building was relentless. It demanded every ounce of resource, every drop of sweat, and every single hour that should have been dedicated to rest or cultivation. Agriculture suffered terribly. Who was left to sow the seeds? Who was left to protect the ripening grain? When every available hand, from the strongest laborer to the smallest child, was dragging 300-pound boulders up a muddy, slippery incline. The chilling shadow of famine stretched long, even as the walls grew impossibly tall. The hill fort's greatest strength, paradoxically, was also its most vulnerable point: the gateways. These were the choke points, the single, terrifying places where the Iron Age enemy could actually breach the promised safety. Thus, the gates were never simple openings.
They were engineered as elaborate, funneling mazes of calculated death and destruction. Approach to the main gate was always oblique, never straight on. This critical architectural trick forced attackers to expose their unshielded side, the right flank, to the deadly torrent of projectiles unleashed by slingers and archers hidden high above in the towering gatehouses and flanking walls. Every piece of timber notched, every stone carefully set in that gatehouse was a prayer, a desperate hope that this intricate, terrifying machine would hold when the inevitable, blood-soaked test arrived. The air around the gateway was permanently charged with dread. It was the physical and psychological epicenter of the siege mentality that now defined their entire existence.
This monumental labor, this sacrifice of peace and physical well-being, demanded a radical transformation of societal power. The old, decentralized tribal structures, suitable for scattered Bronze Age grazing lands, shattered completely under the existential weight of engineering necessity and logistical demand.
Suddenly, the warrior, the man who understood logistics, resource management, and complex defense, the chieftain who could successfully command thousands of laborers and ensure the rampart was built to specification before the next raiding season, became the ultimate, unquestionable power. Obedience was synonymous with survival. Hillforts weren't just defensive structures. They were the silent, physical manifestation of centralized authority, an iron-fisted governance born purely from immediate terror. They solidified the power of the few who promised protection, even if that protection came at the devastating cost of personal freedom and endless, crushing servitude to the wall. The hill fort was their savior, yes, a massive, comforting shield against the world of sharp metal, but it was also an inescapable, gilded cage, trapping them in a desperate, endless cycle of production, defense, and perpetually vigilant fear. They slept when they could force themselves to, knowing the earth they rested upon was soil stolen from the fields and packed solid by the overwhelming, ceaseless fear of the iron sword that hung over every waking moment. The fear was real, but fear does not move mountains. What moved the mountains of chalk, the endless tons of clay, the millions of interlocking stones, was a forced consensus, a debt repaid in bloodied hands and ruined backs. This was not a volunteer effort driven by community spirit. This was survival dictated by the unforgiving silence of the new age, a brutal tax levied on every breath drawn in the British Isles. Imagine the collective groan of an entire population, abandoning the ancestral fields, trading the stability of the plowshare for the aching instability of the wicker basket used to haul soil. Archaeological estimates whisper of the true horror. Some of the largest ramparts, like those crowning the majestic heights of Maiden Castle, required the displacement and stacking of over 1 million cubic meters of earth and rock. This immense project was undertaken, often without the aid of oxen, complex wheelbarrows, or sophisticated Bronze Age levers, because the very technology that made the iron sword possible had also necessitated the rapid, panicked mobilization that bypassed slow, careful engineering development. They used bone, ampler picks, and sheer, grinding human willpower. The Hillforts were not just simple fences erected against a neighborly skirmish. They were layered, defensive nightmares for any would-be attacker, a testament to the extreme paranoia wrought by the speed of iron death. We are talking about multi-valet defenses, a term so cold and academic, yet describing a terror so palpable it leaves historical scorch marks. These were not singular walls, but concentric rings of defensive structures, built with a maniacal attention to maximizing time delay, confusing the enemy, and creating lethal defensive choke points. The Iron Age builders understood that if they couldn't stop the attack, they had to slow it down until it bled out. First, you had the fosse, the ditch, not merely a slight trench, but a gaping, unnatural wound torn into the earth, often V-shaped and impossibly steep. These ditches were sometimes 30 feet deep from the top of the inner bank, designed specifically to shatter the momentum and psychological resilience of any charging unit before they even reached the first earthwork. This negative space was as strategically lethal as the walls themselves, a physical and psychological barrier that screamed a terrible, ancient challenge. You are already defeated before you even set foot on our soil. The material excavated from this monstrous ditch became the foundation of the rampart itself, compounding the engineering effort into a synergistic loop of fear and construction. Then came the ramparts, the primary defensive banks. Early construction often utilized the notorious box rampart technique. Massive structural timbers laced together like a coffin for the earth, filled with rubble, stones, and packed clay. This created a rigid, intimidating structure that was nearly impervious to the rudimentary siege techniques of the early Iron Age. The labor was relentless, the pressure absolute. Think of the forest clearing necessary just to source the timber for the internal lacing. The endless procession of workers carrying stones from distant riverbeds or quarry sites to fill the void. Every single stone placed was a prayer against the swift, dark efficiency of the iron blade. But even the most impervious fortress has its fatal flaw, and for the Hillforts, that flaw was the entrance. The great gates were the breathing holes of the fortified world, the necessary point of egress, and thus the most heavily defended and complex features of the entire structure. They had to be robust enough to withstand a frontal assault, yet functional enough to allow the rapid flow of thousands of people and vast herds of livestock during an immediate emergency evacuation. The genius, or perhaps the utter desperation, of the Iron Age engineers lay in their handling of this vulnerability. They engineered these entrances not as simple straight lines leading into the heart of the community, but as winding, overlapping passages, the legendary in-turned entrance. An attacker who breached the outer defenses was instantly funneled into a narrow corridor, a suffocating gauntlet where they were exposed, disoriented, and flanked on both sides by defenders raining down projectiles from specialized fighting platforms built right into the rampart terminals. This architecture created a lethal killing zone, often culminating in a massive timbered gate protected by projecting hornworks, curving outgrowths of the ramparts, designed to slow, confuse, and utterly annihilate the enemy before they ever touched the main barrier. It was defensive architecture, conceived not by calculating geometers, but by minds utterly consumed by the dread of immediate, efficient, iron-driven death. The Hillforts didn't just protect the people, they redefined them. The necessity for constant vigilance and centralized labor turned tribal life into something resembling a perpetual military mobilization machine. Everyone from the youngest child hauling clay baskets to the elderly overseeing the timber repairs at the gate was bound into this colossal, fearful mechanism. They were no longer simply farmers or artisans. They were cogs in the great iron defense system, monuments to the fact that sometimes the only way to survive a technological leap is to wall yourself off from the future it promises. This was the terrible price of survival in Iron Age Britain, turning the entire landscape into a network of stone and earth screams, echoing the silent, ceaseless terror of the Iron Age blade that had stolen their sleep and demanded their mountains. The landscape screamed, but the silence of the workers was even more terrifying. The fear was a currency, and the Iron Age chieftains, the new warlords of panic, were the bankers, demanding payment in sweat, blood, and the utter obliteration of traditional life. The decentralized villages of the Bronze Age, scattered and trusting, were deemed obsolete, suicide pacts waiting to happen when the new metal arrived. The entire populace was mobilized, not by patriotism or communal spirit, but by a paralyzing, cold sweat terror that drove them into organized, centralized labor battalions that stripped the countryside bare for material. Moving mountains of earth, chalk, and stone was the only price of admission to survival. Imagine the sheer, staggering scale of the excavation. Ditch systems not just dug, but carved into the unforgiving chalk bedrock, sometimes 3, 4, or even 5 concentric rings of absolute defensive hell surrounding the summit. These were not casual ditches. They were V-shaped, flat-bottomed, or deep, vertical-sided chasms designed to break the momentum of a rush attack and trap the attackers for execution from above. The ramparts themselves, massive bulwarks of piled clay and timber, required hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of material, hauled up impossibly steep, slick slopes by thousands of weary backs. Every muscle strain, every snapped rope, every fall was a testament to to the horrifying efficiency of the new iron weapons waiting in the hands of the unknown enemy across the valley. The chieftains didn't pay them in coins. They paid them in the fragile, thin promise of continuing to breathe. A promise that felt increasingly threadbare under the relentless sun. This was not construction. It was societal exorcism, attempting to wall out a curse that had already infected their very souls. And here lies the deep, agonizing irony that defined this apocalyptic era. To build the defense against the iron. And here lies the deep, agonizing irony that defined this apocalyptic era. To build the defense against the iron blade, they needed the iron tools. Axes, picks, mattocks, tools forged in the very fires of the catastrophic technology they were attempting to wall out. They were forced into a desperate Faustian embrace of the curse to survive the curse. A pact with the devil made in the muddy, exhausted pits of the construction sites. The smiths, once respected artisans focused on the beautiful, ritualistic perfection of bronze, were now enslaved to the terrifying, pragmatic efficiency of iron mass production, creating the tools that simultaneously built their prison walls and sharpened the blades that threatened to tear them down. Their workshops became the most guarded, most critical, and most paranoid places in all of Iron Age Britain. They were the heart of the paradox, the source of both salvation and absolute ruin, working under the constant, heavy scrutiny of the chieftain's guards, lest a single piece of the dreadful metal fall into the wrong, malicious hands. But the true engineering nightmare, the focus of all dread, was the gatehouse. These were not mere openings in the wall. They were complex, terrifying choke points designed to bleed the attacker dry. Funnels of death, where the enemy's own desperate charge was weaponized against them. These structures became the ultimate test of Iron Age ingenuity. Multi-layered labyrinths involving overlapping walls, guard towers perched precariously over the entrance, and massive, thick timber doors, often reinforced with precious iron fittings. The approach was never straight, never convenient. It was meticulously angled, forcing the attacker to expose their shieldless right flank while navigating a narrow, killing corridor. A tactical masterstroke born entirely out of the sheer necessity to nullify the speed and penetrating advantage of the Iron Age sword. Every stone laid in the gatehouse was a calculated sacrifice of convenience for absolute, murderous security. The internal change was as revolutionary as the external defenses. People who had lived for generations in scattered, independent farmsteads were now forced into a crowded, stressful existence within the Hillfort walls. This sudden, traumatic process of nucleation was dictated entirely by the economics of fear. You could not defend 100 small settlements. You could only defend one gigantic, concentrated fortress. Imagine the constant noise, the complete loss of privacy, the crushing strain on water and grazing resources, all dictated by the iron shadow lurking just beyond the horizon. The Hillfort became a city of sustained stress, a gigantic pressure cooker of tribal tension, where disputes over every tiny resource flared up daily, barely contained by the absolute, often brutal authority of the warlord chieftains who ruled from their elevated central palisades. These new rulers were not patriarchs of tradition. They were managers of mass panic and logistical nightmares, their power amplified exponentially by the crisis. The Hillfort was their throne, built entirely out of the collective fear of their subjects. They had bought their safety, yes, but at the excruciating cost of their old social fabric and their deep ancestral peace of mind. The overwhelming investment of a generation of labor meant that the Hillfort could not fail. Its integrity was the only thing standing between the tribe and immediate, brutal annihilation, delivered by the speed of the iron sword. They slept perhaps, but they slept lightly, listening to the relentless, omnipresent wind whistle through the multiple ramparts, hearing the distant echo of the hammers that built their sanctuary, knowing that the moment the fear subsided, the energy to maintain the vigilance would fail, and that would be the catastrophic moment the Iron Age finally came for their throats. The mountain walls were their shield, but they were also their constant, suffocating reminder that their freedom had been traded for an eternal, terrified vigilance. A life lived forever, looking over the defensive parapet.